On this episode of Newt's World, when Vice President Kamala Harris announced her running mate in 2024 would be the current governor of Minnesota, Tim Walz, many of us did not know that much about him. Walz was a teacher, a football coach, a congressman from Minnesota's 1st District, and currently serves as the governor of Minnesota. But when he hit the national stage, very little was known about his politics. In his new book about Walz, Behind the Veil, A Stand Against Governor Tim Walz, Paul Gazelka tells the real story. Gazelka worked alongside Walz when he served as Minnesota's Senate Majority Leader from 2017 to 2021. Following the vice presidential debate on Tuesday night, our conversation couldn't be timelier. So I'm really pleased to welcome my guest, someone who knows Walz personally, has worked with Walz, and has great stories to tell, Paul Gazelka. Paul, welcome, and thank you for joining me on Newt's World.
Well, Newt, it's great to be on your show, and it's been a while since I've seen you and been with you, and so it's like one of my favorite national leaders, the contract with America, and so really glad to be talking to you.
I have to tell you, I received several emails from friends when your book came out. I ordered it right away, and I think it is probably the most revealing book about Walz that I know of. So you have a unique position. But before we get to the book and to the past, we just had this vice presidential debate, and I'm curious what your reaction was to Walz's performance.
I think Vance slaughtered him. He looked like a deer in the headlights. And when you have to memorize what you're going to say, which is what Walz had to do, versus Vance knowing clarity what he wanted to say, you could see one candidate was very calm. The other candidate just seemed really, really nervous. And, so I don't think he did well. And I was surprised that he didn't even have to talk about his role as a leader in Minnesota, because there was plenty of other things that he could talk about to show his strengths. I'm talking Vance.
Clifton and I watched the debate, and I sort of had the feeling that there were moments where Walz just blanked out, that he wasn't sure what was going on or what to do. And I'm curious, when you dealt with him, what was your sense of him in that sense? When you negotiated directly with him, what was that like?
The negotiations at first, pre-COVID, I thought he wanted to raise taxes a lot, and he wanted to do an extreme left agenda policy-wise. And I'd already had 2 years of experience as leader, and so we really, really did well. We ended up lowering taxes, the biggest tax cut in Minnesota history, of which he tried to take credit for at the Democrat National Convention. But once he got emergency powers, once he had to make decisions about the riots after the death of George Floyd, he froze there too, where he kind of went into this frozen. He wouldn't make a decision. Well, that was the experience I had through many decisions related to COVID and many decisions related to the riots, and then even beyond that.
There's a lot of conversation about his inability to tell the truth. And I was particularly struck last night when they asked him about Tiananmen Square. And he started by, wandering around and meandering. And the moderator came back and said, well, what I asked you about was, why did you say you were at Tiananmen Square when you weren't there? And he said, one of the great lines of the debates I've ever seen, he said, I'm just a knucklehead. In your sense, when you dealt with him, was he generally honest, or did you have a constant challenge to know what was behind what he was saying?
Well, particularly in public, his conversation with the media was typically grandiose, exaggeration, or lying, depending on how you wanted to define it. But they didn't really fact check him a lot in Minnesota. It's coming out more later. I worked with Governor Mark Dayton. He was a Democrat before Walz, and a handshake deal was a handshake deal. And that's why we got along pretty well. It wasn't quite that with Tim Walz. I never really felt like I knew exactly where he was coming from, what he was trying to do. And that's hard to govern with somebody on the opposite side of the aisle when that's how you feel.
That doesn't speak well of him, but I have to say, having negotiated for years with Bill Clinton, you always knew that you didn't know. Clinton's capacity to look you in the face, tell you how totally he was with you, and 3 minutes later indicate that he didn't really quite mean always with you meant always with you. It was just amazing. And I get the sense that Walz, in that sense, is not as sophisticated and congenital as Bill was.
Well, I think there's nobody at that level, but, and I put a lot of that in the book Behind the Veil because I wanted people to see how he negotiated, how he made decisions. Once COVID hit, I had complete text strings of all of our conversations through all of these decision-making, what I said he should do, what he ended up doing. I just didn't put him word for word in the book, just because there is some benefit of behind-the-scene conversations. But he's not a good leader in a crisis. The number one thing I hope people understand, when a crisis hits, he's not a good leader. And then the second one is when he has power, he can't be trusted. I mean, with emergency powers, literally, I got the Democrats in Minnesota's House to agree with me against his wishes to take his powers away from him after he'd had it for almost a year and a half.
Was it your sense occasionally he just froze up?
I'll tell you where he really froze up. A very important example of that was the death of George Floyd was on a Monday. Everybody saw that video. I mean, it was gripping. Tuesdays, the riots started, and that should have been a clue. Wednesday, the mayor of Minneapolis asked Walz for the National Guard, and that's when he really froze, sat on his hands. Thursday, the 3rd Precinct police station burned down, first one in over 100 years in America. Now I'm texting him behind the scenes. Where are you? He was very defensive. He said, well, you should get with your buddy Bob Kroll. He was the head of Minneapolis police. And I tried to connect those two. Friday, Wells Fargo burns down. Now it's 1,500 buildings damaged or destroyed, $500 million worth of damage. Now I'm calling the White House and I'm asking them to get a message to Trump that he's going to have to intervene. And finally, on Saturday, he finally got the National Guard out at night and they turned the tide. But then, as we started to go through the records, we did hearings in Minnesota Senate, and the general, John Jensen of the National Guard, we asked him under testimony, could you have stopped this had you been called up sooner? And the short answer is absolutely yes. He blamed the mayor of Minneapolis. Then the Minneapolis mayor showed proof that he asked. Then he said, well, they're just a bunch of 19-year-old cooks anyway, the National Guard. So poor decision maker. And then once the decisions he made were bad, he blamed others for them rather than what a good leader does, say, I was wrong. I'll take the heat.
I'm surprised by your comment about, 19-year-old cooks, because he makes a great deal out of his own role in the Guard. And you'd have thought that he had some sense of respect for the Minnesota Guard.
You would think that. I mean, and that's, even when I was pushing him, he said, well, you've never served. I was 3 years out of high school right after Vietnam, and I didn't. And I am grateful for those that do serve. But he positions himself as for rural America. And it's like, that is the opposite of the direction he's going. He got caught on tape once when he was running for governor talking about northern Minnesota, rural Minnesota. He said that just a bunch of rocks and cows out there anyway. He might have thought it was funny, either the Guard comments or the rural Minnesota, but it really is something that shows a lack of respect for those people.
Were you surprised, given everything you knew, when Kamala picked him?
I was very surprised. And here's what I told somebody. I said, if she picks Walz, it shows that she's a weak leader. If she picks Shapiro, even though there's some pressure because he's Jewish and she had a lot of Muslim supporters, I thought if she goes that route, it shows she's a little bit stronger leader, that she's willing to take a little bit of heat. But she picked Tim Walz, and I thought, honestly, it shocked. When I wrote the manuscript Behind the Veil, I wasn't thinking about it as something to speak against Tim Walz and don't hire him. I was just writing about my experiences in government and how to make government work in a divided state. But then suddenly he's the guy, and I've got the manuscript written. And so we rushed to get it out. I focused the second half of the book on many of his leadership decisions that really show what kind of a leader he is, and it's not good.
Why do you think she picked Walz?
My guess is she didn't realize all of this stuff that would come out about him. I think she figured he's going to represent rural America. She's got to win many swing states that are spread out throughout that area. And I don't think she knew what she got. But, he's a great cheerleader for her. But I don't view either one of them as strong leaders. And actually, even though I don't think he's a good leader, I think he's a stronger leader than she is. So he's going to have a lot of influence in her administration if they win. I hope that's not the case, but that's why I want people to read the book.
You served with 3 different governors, Tim Plenty, an old friend of mine, who's a Republican, and then the Democrats, Mark Dayton and Tim Walz. How would you compare the 3?
Well, both Plenty and Mark Dayton were very effective, and I think people saw as very genuine. I mean, Mark Dayton was heading a different direction than where I wanted to go, but at least you knew where he was coming from. He spoke to a Chamber of Commerce event, a large dinner, and he chews out the crowd and says, you all need to pay more taxes. Well, that's where he was coming from, so at least he told us. But with Walz, he was just a little more coy, and you didn't really know who he was or what he was trying to accomplish. So as he's trying to position himself as this moderate, when he was a congressman, he was in a rural district, so his voting record was moderate. But as soon as he was running for governor, he got rid of his NRA hat, and every policy he tried to do was far left. We just stopped him. In Minnesota, we had a 1-seat majority in the Senate, our Republican majority. Everything else was controlled by Democrats. The courts, 7 appointed Supreme Court judges right now are appointed by Democrats, every statewide office by Democrats. So we were able to stop him, but he was trying to do all those things. And then in 2023, he got the trifecta, and everything that I said he was trying to do, he actually did, and it wasn't good.
Our mutual friend, former Congressman Vin Weber, has said to me that once they had complete power in the House, Senate, and governorship, they ran through one of the most radical state legislative programs in the country, and that he had gone to the White House and said, this is how you do it. So if you win in 2024, this is how you can come in and really drive the country to the left very fast.
Yeah, it's interesting, too. He only did one debate when he ran for governor the second time around and stays away from the media. So that game plan you can see for Harris and Walz now. But to give you an idea, in 2023 then, we had an $18 billion surplus because we didn't want to spend it and they didn't want tax relief. He spent all of that. He raised taxes $10 billion, increased spending 40% in 1 year. And then now we show a structural deficit in the future for Minnesota. As far as policy, he says he's for reproductive rights, but it's abortion all the way up to birth. And he eliminated 2 simple compromises we had. Number one, if a young lady got pregnant, we gave them resources to help that woman be successful. He took all that money away. And then we had passed a born alive legislative policy, which simply said, if abortion is botched, that baby's alive, the doctor needs to help that baby survive. He eliminated that language too. So in the debate, when he says it's not what you say, it is what Vance was pointing out to him. Maybe 2 others. Clean energy, they passed by 2040, utilities have to have 100% renewable energy or carbon free. It's impossible in Minnesota. We don't have enough nuclear. Wind doesn't work when it's 22 below or colder. Solar if it's not sunny. And so it doesn't work, but they did it anyway. And then one last one, when he brags about paid family leave, they say if you're an employer with 1 employee, you have to pay this tax. The employee does too. And that employee can have up to 20 weeks off every single year. They have to be eligible, but I can envision some employees may milk that system, and it doesn't work. That's why I say extreme, because he really was.
You're describing on energy something which is happening all over the industrial world, and in places like Germany, they're beginning to collapse because it so clearly is not sustainable. Why do you think when the experts come in and they explain you're not going to have any electricity, we need more electricity, not less, because of the huge computing power for artificial intelligence. Why do these guys not notice that there is a real world?
I can only assume that they think their base loves that rhetoric, but it's their job, it's all of our jobs to help people connect the dots between what works and what doesn't work and how fast we do it. I'm not against clean energy. I'm not against electric cars, but let the market drive it. I think J.D. Vance was brilliant last night when he said, if you really care about clean energy, let's bring those jobs back to America where we do it cleaner than anybody else. But every one of those issues, I feel like they're pandering to their base. For example, during the riots in Minnesota, one of the reasons I think he sat on his hands is because a big number of those protesters were their base. And so he didn't want to turn them off. So he's trying to make a decision, threading the needle between them and protecting the state. But in the end, the state is the one that lost.
Several friends close to Hez, they now live in Minneapolis, and one of them lives in a neighborhood where the police station was burned down, where the local store was burned down. I mean, it went from being a really nice middle-class neighborhood to being a disaster in 4 days.
I used to call Minneapolis and St. Paul shining cities. I mean, they were far safer. Once the riots began, what followed was a very anti-police movement of which Governor Walz was leading. I just wouldn't let him do all these anti-police policies, but the Minneapolis police force went from 800 members down to about 350, and they had wanted to grow to 1,200. So they were just not enough. They couldn't do their job. They weren't appreciated. And Tim Walz was not standing up for him. During the riots, I went to the basement of the Capitol where all of these police groups were meeting. They were staging to go take back the streets. He never showed up there. He never, ever thanked them for the risk that they were taking to take our streets back. And carjackings went up to almost, I think it was like 2 a day at the peak in Minneapolis when it had been much more rare. And so all of that is because of bad leadership.
Most of my life, going to the cities, you saw it as one of the nicest and cleanest and safest places in America. And all of a sudden you have entire neighborhoods that are dangerous.
Yeah. And I think a big part of that is if you don't appreciate the police and you make it difficult for them to do their job, and then if they make a mistake, you put the hammer down, which is what Walz and Attorney General Keith Ellison did in Minnesota, you're not going to have the same kind of impact that you wanted to have to keep your cities safe. I'm a big believer in backing the men and women in blue, and they, like us, if there's a bad apple in their group, they want to pluck that bad apple out too. But you don't throw away all the good police officers and the work they do for us.
At a statewide level, you're the largest center of Somali refugees in the country. What's their impact on the politics and governance of Minnesota?
Well, they vote almost completely Democrat. It's about 100,000 people. I will say when I was in office, I was trying to make inroads into their communities because many of their beliefs line up more on the Republican side. I heard from one Democrat legislator that was ousted by another Democrat challenger who was Somali that he thought that there was corruption in that race. It wasn't enough in the Trump election to make a difference in Minnesota, but there is influence. Congressman Omar is from a district that is heavily populated with the Somalis. And even when she's challenged by the Democrat side, she seems to hold her own.
One of the places, I would say, rivaling the mishandling of the riots was the weird stuff that Walz did during COVID. You say this in your book. He issued an order that said you could have up to 50 people at a bar and 10 people in a church. I mean, what is the rationale for that?
There is no rationale. I think what it showed was he doesn't give a lot of weight to the church community and the need for spiritual connections. And I mean, that was like the last straw for some of these church leaders. My wife said, let's just do church in bars. We're going to disregard it. So I was doing Zoom meetings with the church, and I put this in the book Behind the Veil because I wanted people to understand some of the dynamics of actually having to work against him. And these church leaders, they wanted to work with the governor, any governor, but they finally reached a point where they said, we're going to open up anyway. We don't care what you say. I think it was their constitutional right. If you have a Walmart open with 500 people, then you have to have a church open. That brought him back to the table. It all happened behind the scenes, but then he finally agreed to 250 people. But you couldn't do funerals. You couldn't do weddings. But suddenly the George Floyd funeral, well, we can do that one. So he picked and chose winners and losers. That's where I say he didn't handle power well, because he thought, I can decide all of this. It was like king-like powers. I remember behind the scenes, he said, I'm going to buy a morgue. And I said, you don't need a morgue. Why don't you lease the building? Why don't you get freezer trucks? And that's where it's nice to have the documentation. He went ahead and did it. He said 50,000 people are going to die. At the same time, I looked at the same data, the same science, and I said it's going to be 5,000 people. And a year later, it was 5,000 people, and we never used the morgue. These decision-making in crisis, he looks at the data wrong, or he freezes. And now, let's say he's second in command of the United States of America. You do not get do-overs against Russia or China or Iran or North Korea. And that's what you're bringing to the table if you're electing him.
I read somewhere that at the point where he had closed the churches, he allowed Mall of the Americas to open on the grounds that retail therapy was very important. I love the concept of retail therapy.
Yeah. And that's why I say he really undervalued the church. And, you know, he used a scripture last night, and I kind of smiled because when I was in negotiations with him, I felt all of these negotiation strategies, and I just smiled because I knew where I wanted to go. But one of them was occasionally quoting me a scripture because he knows I'm a follower of Christ, and somehow that's going to sway me into his rhetoric. But I didn't think he valued the church enough. Otherwise, certainly they would have had at least 50 when bars have 50.
And I get a sense that he meets, but he doesn't necessarily listen.
I think that's a really good way to say it, because he'd often say, I hear you, Paul, but it was like, you don't hear me. For example, when he's talking about 50,000 people will die, and he took the personal protection equipment away from surgical centers so they couldn't make a profit, he did leave abortion centers open. But I said, Governor, are you looking at the data? I said, are you looking to New York? Because in New York, I said, they have 4 times the population of Minnesota, but they don't have the beds being used that you say are going to be in Minnesota. But I hear you, but he didn't listen. So that's where it was very frustrating under emergency powers, because as an almost equal leader, Senate Majority Leader versus governor, he had to listen to me. Under emergency powers, he could take it under consideration, but he got to do whatever he wanted to do.
On medical issues, when you have things as famous as the Mayo Clinic, that he certainly was surrounded by people who had a pretty sophisticated understanding of the issues.
Yeah, and I think the University of Minnesota, the Mayo Clinic, didn't have all the answers on it. I think it's sort of like, I think they were looking at worst case scenario, and I was trying to weigh out the economic problems, the drug addiction problems, the foreclosure problems. So I tried to see it bigger. And when you see it that way, you're willing to take some risks because there's other risks of not taking those risks. So I realized that people were all over the board on COVID. That's why I don't focus a lot on that issue, but his leadership decisions, that one, the riots, one other one I'll give you, and I put this in the book Behind the Veil as well, is there's a statue of Christopher Columbus, was a statue right next to our Capitol. And Mike Forcia, who was part of the American Indian movement back in the 70s, put out a statement. He's going to tear that statue down in the afternoon. And the governor saw it. He was fully aware of it. And he put one highway patrol out next to that statue as a group of 50 to 100 people came up to that statue. Mike Forcia had a rope in his hand, standing right next to the highway patrol person. That person, the highway patrol person, then goes into the Capitol where there's scores and scores of highway patrol. Mike Forcia throws a rope around the neck and pulls the statue down. And I was a mile away having either lunch or dinner. I can't remember what it was, a meal. I got up there right away and it was already on a flatbed truck being hauled away. And I thought, this is an assumption now, but I believe he knew it. I believe he looked the other way and let a mob do it. And that is the worst kind of leadership decision I can possibly imagine.
This whole notion of catering to the hard left, which of course fits perfectly in a Harris-Walz ticket because she was sending out recommendations to give money to an organization in Minneapolis that was bailing out the rioters. You have Harris in favor of putting the rioters back on the street, while you have Walz trying not to use the National Guard to stop them. I mean, in some ways, it's a perfect ticket.
If you want to go straight far left and ruin the country we have, that is why I've been so aggressive. I'm normally fairly mild-mannered. I like government to work. I try to build compromise, but sometimes you have to confront, and that's what I'm doing in this case against Tim Walz. I mean, putting the book out, it definitely made a statement, and I hope people buy it. I mean, just go to Amazon and type in Behind the Veil and you can find it. But people need to be aware of what kind of leader he is. They saw last night that he's a terrible debater, but what is he like when he makes decisions?
One of the things I've been working on is the whole issue of corruption in government, because the average American is very convinced that large parts of the government are just plain corrupt. It's not that they're liberal or conservative or they're inefficient. They're just corrupt. And you have, in the Walz administration, a perfect example in an organization called Feeding Our Future, which apparently stole $250 million.
Yeah, and that's just one of multiple groups that took money. We had another program to pay frontline workers during COVID, a bonus, and that one they abused. They gave out over $200 million to people that didn't qualify. And then there's Medicaid issues. All total, more than $500 million of fraud and waste. And so we brought in the OLA, the Office of Legislative Auditor. It's nonpartisan. And they were pounding Governor Walz and his administration for not being responsible for the dollars that are coming into Minnesota. And they just made excuses. I mean, it's excuses about the riots, it's excuses about everything rather than just taking responsibility. But waste and fraud is a big deal. I mean, obviously, our federal government is far beyond Minnesota. And if they're in charge, I don't think he's going to do any better there. I think it'll be worse.
Which gets me to sort of my final big topic, which is, if Harris and Walz do win, what would worry you the most?
The biggest thing for me is if we have a huge national crisis, particularly against a foreign country, I don't think he is even close to ready. I think his ability to decide, first of all, it's too slow. And oftentimes, you have to make decisions on the fly where you're gathering information and his compass doesn't point to the right decision. And I do think if Harris is the president, I think she's weaker yet. So if he's who she's leaning on for advice, I think it really brings us in the wrong direction. I mean, I don't think he has a good grasp of what it takes to make money. I just don't think he's business savvy at all. I don't think he understands how hard it is to make money. And so I don't think he really cares about the taxpayer in the way I think he should. And so those are all other issues that I care about. But the biggest one is making a decision in a crisis. I don't think he's ready.
Well, if you look at the war in the Middle East, the war in Ukraine, the threat to Taiwan, the southern border, there are a lot of places where you'd better have a strong leader because we're in real trouble.
Harris has proven that she's not a strong leader. I mean, she was border czar, and it's terrible. Walz has proven he's not a strong leader. And so 2 weak leaders doesn't make a strong leader. And, versus Trump. Trump's done a good job. A lot of people don't like his personality and that he's abrasive, but I'll tell you what, I'd rather have a strong leader than a weak leader any day.
So this is probably a little bit of a silly thing to end on, but I can't resist. Can you explain the whole coach thing? I mean, was he a coach? They're running around with her calling him coach. Oh, I'm so glad coach is here. But I keep hearing that he was like a volunteer.
He was an assistant coach. He had a DUI in Nebraska, and I don't really focus on that much, but I think that's part of the reason he was only an assistant coach. The assistant coach doesn't make the decisions. He didn't make decisions in the National Guard. What I tell people is, look, he was a teacher. So during COVID, he should have known that you should never keep kids out of school for a long, long time. He was an assistant coach. He should have known you never should put a mask on kids playing basketball. I mean, how silly, how dumb is that? He was a National Guard member. He should have never cut down the National Guard as 19-year-old cooks. He should have known that they could do their job. So every area that he brags about, I look at it and I say, well, you should have known that. And I don't dislike Tim Walz. I don't think he's the right guy. And I'm one of the few people that knows him really, really well behind the scenes. And I say, I'm the reference that says, don't hire him. That's the reference I am.
It's okay to have him over for iced tea and cookies, but let's not give him any kind of power.
We promised each other before he was VP candidate that we'd get a beer sometime because, you have those epic battles. Governor Dayton still calls me. Lenny and I, when we're in Florida, we get together. But, maybe I'm a little bit too strong now where that isn't going to happen. But I don't dislike him. I just think he's the wrong guy for the job.
Paul, I really want to thank you for joining me. Having an eyewitness who's actually worked with him is very helpful. Your new book, Behind the Veil, A Stand Against Governor Tim Walz, is terrific. I highly recommend it. It's available now on Amazon. And our listeners can keep up with what you're doing on your website, Gazelka.com. So thank you so much for being with us.
Newt, it was an incredible honor. Thank you for what you're doing. I love that you are continuing to just lead the way. Thank you so much.
Thank you to my guest, Paul Gazelka. You can get a link to buy his new book, Behind the Veil, A Stand Against Governor Tim Walz, on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan, and our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcast and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.